Hello, welcome to today's Learn at Lunchtime program from the State Museum of Pennsylvania. I am Beth Erickson. Our topic today is the rise and fall of the American chestnut. And with us is Joe Franckiewicz, environmental educator at Raccoon Creek State Park. Hello, Joe. Thank you for presenting today's program.
Hi, Beth. My pleasure to be joining you today.
So tell us a bit about yourself, what you do, and what you're going to share with us today.
Well, I'm one of the educators at Raccoon Creek State Park. I've been working here since 2020, and today we'll be talking about the American chestnut, which is a very tragic tale of a very important tree. So we'll learn about why this tree came to be so important in our area and why it's a lot harder to find nowadays.
That sounds great. So let's get started with today's program to find out more. So Joe, when you're ready, you can begin.
All right, sounds good. So today we are talking about the American chestnut, which is a large hardwood species of tree. The scientific name for the American chestnut is Castanea dentata. And this tree is native to most of the eastern United States. In a little bit, we'll take a look at that range map. And it grows pretty much throughout the Appalachian Mountains, particularly in some of the higher elevations of these mountains. And it used to be a very commercially and culturally important tree throughout the people of the Appalachian Mountains. And so here we can see highlighted in green the range of the American chestnut tree. At the very northern reach of its range, you can find it in Maine, and it ranges all the way down to Mississippi. And I always like to compare and contrast the range map of the American chestnut, which is on the left, with the map of what we define as the cultural region known as Appalachia. And as you can see, it is almost an exact overlay of each other. This tree and this region very much go hand in hand with each other. In terms of identifying this tree, it can sometimes be a pretty difficult one to ID, especially when you consider the other species of chestnuts that have been introduced to North America. But for starters, it has broad, simple leaves with what we call dentate margins, or that's just a fancy botanical way of saying that they have a toothed edge on them, like the teeth on a saw. They are alternately arranged, and we'll go more into detail on what that means on the next slide. The fruits are these spiny green husks, each one containing 2 to 3 large edible nuts. And those husks are very spiny. If you were to pick one up in your hand, it's almost too painful to hold in your bare hand. I usually handle these with thick leather gardening gloves because they are very, very spiny. The buds, which we can see in the top left photo, are sort of pointed and the stems are hairless. That helps differentiate it from other chestnut species. And the flowers are these long, whitish, yellowish, what we call catkins, which a catkin is just a cluster of many small flowers that are kind of fuzzy, very small, and the chestnut makes these white catkins right around June. And the bark on the tree has these very wide, flat ridges and fissures in them. We can see in the bottom right-hand photo those wide, flat ridges in the bark. Now, I mentioned that the American chestnut is alternately arranged, and essentially what that boils down to is there are 2 different ways that trees typically arrange their twigs. We have oppositely arranged twigs, where the buds, the leaves, and the twigs emerge from the same point on the stem. We call that point a node. So if we look at this diagram here, you have a twig on either side of the main stem. And here in Pennsylvania, the only trees that really do this are maples, ashes, dogwoods, and buckeyes. More often than not, our trees in Pennsylvania do an alternate arrangement, which is where the buds, the leaves, and the twigs emerge from alternating points along the stem. So we can compare these 2 diagrams. And some examples of alternately arranged trees would be things like our oaks, hickories, beeches, as well as our chestnuts. And this tree, back in its heyday, was a very, very large tree by East Coast standards, of course. There are accounts of them easily reaching heights of over 100 feet. And Gifford Pinchot, the former governor of Pennsylvania, who is widely regarded as the father of American forestry, he was also the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. He recalled seeing chestnut trees that were as wide as 13 feet in terms of the trunk. I would personally believe Gifford Pinchot, given his extensive forestry background, and a 13-foot wide tree is really, really tremendous. And the crowns of these trees would also extend to tremendous proportions as well. You can have these branches reaching out as far as 120 feet. So in some cases, this is a tree that almost grows as wide as it is tall. These trees are so big that there's a account of a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains who talks about an instance in which a man who has a farm nearby lost some of his sheep in a snowstorm and later found those sheep hiding in the hollow of a chestnut tree. So imagine a tree so large that your livestock could actually hide in the hollowed out portion of the trunk. Really an amazing tree. From a cultural perspective, throughout the Appalachian region, this was a source of both food and money for people. Kids would collect these chestnuts. We can see in this artwork here, they would send one child up the tree to shake the branches while their would sit below it and collect those chestnuts that fall to the ground. And they would actually refer to this as their shoe money for the year. They would collect them in fall, and then by winter, they would have enough money to buy a new pair of shoes. And of course, people of the region have very fond memories of roasting these chestnuts in the winter. So culturally, also a significant tree. And it was also a very important timber species. So chestnut wood was famously very strong, very rot resistant, easy to work with. It was the ideal wood. The trees not only grew very large, but they also grew fast, making very high quality lumber in a relatively short amount of time. And in 1909, the industry of chestnut timber alone was valued at more than $20 million. That's excluding all other species. That is solely chestnut lumber. And it would be used to make all kinds of things, including roofing shingles, telephone poles, railroad ties, fences. It was referred to as a cradle-to-grave tree because these trees were quite literally used to make both cradles and caskets. The bark, very high in tannins, so people would also strip the bark off the trees, boil them down to extract those tannins and make leather. And in Tennessee alone in 1912, 50,000 cords of chestnut wood were cut every year to supply just to tanneries. If you're unfamiliar with how big a cord of wood is, that's about as much wood as can fit in an 8-foot truck bed. So picture 50,000 pickup trucks with all of their beds full of wood, and that's the kind of output that was coming out of just Tennessee. From an agricultural perspective, this tree also had a hand in the way we raise livestock. Back in the day, people would just let their hogs and cattle roam around the woods and forage off of these chestnuts. They were very high in nutrients, and it made raising hogs very cheap in Appalachia because you can just let them go out into the forest, forage on these chestnuts, and you wouldn't have to be so concerned with buying food for them. And it was such an easy thing to do that mountain pork became known as sort of a name brand commodity and was seen as superior to pork from other regions of the US, specifically from the Appalachian Mountains. It was seen as high quality pork. And not only livestock, but people also consume chestnuts as a food source. And records of a railroad station in West Virginia that shipped 155 posts in the year 1911. So food for livestock and food for people. And indigenous people have many uses for the tree as well. In particular, the Cherokee Nation has a lot of uses for the chestnut tree, or at least they did when this tree was still in its heyday. The nuts would be ground up and added to dough to make bread. The leaves would be steeped in drank as a tea to alleviate heart troubles, and the sprouts would be used to make an astringent that would be used to disinfect and heal wounds. And not just the Cherokee, but other tribes utilize the tree as well, including the Iroquois and the Mohegan. And there is a wide range of uses from cough syrup to stomach remedies to heart medicine, firewood, uh, hair conditioner, roasting the nuts as coffee, grinding the wood up into baby powder, making desserts, mosquito repellent, autism, whooping cough. Across the board, there were many, many, many uses for this tree, and to wildlife as well. So wildlife, of course, forage on these nuts as well, including things like black bears, turkeys, squirrels, deer, raccoons, ruffed grouse, and other animals as well. Chestnuts are not only high in fat, but they're also very high in protein. This is incredibly important for animals like bears, for example, which need to put on a lot of weight before winter. They would fatten up on these chestnuts. The trees would provide habitat for animals like bobcats, mountain lions back in the day when mountain lions lived in Pennsylvania. Birds of prey would roost in their branches. And those flowers would serve as a food source for many different species of moths and butterflies. So right off the bat, it sounds like this chestnut tree was a very important tree. So you might be thinking to yourselves, well, what happened to it? Well, our story begins in 1904 when there was a forester at the New York Zoological Park who noticed that a lot of the chestnut trees in the park were looking pretty sick. And what was happening is there was a fungus known as chestnut blight, scientific name Cryphonectria parasitica. And this blight had been brought over by Japanese chestnuts. This is a non-native species of chestnut from Japan. They were brought over as a ornamental nursery species, and they had this blight on them. By 1912, pretty much all the chestnut trees in New York City were dead. So these are pictures of what that chestnut blight looks like. It causes these reddish-orange cankers and eventually causes the bark to split and rot. And this blight moved fast. If you think about it, a tree disease shouldn't move that quickly. Trees are rooted in the ground, they do move around, but this blight moved as fast as 50 miles a year. It hitchhiked on lumbermen going into the mountains. It would hitchhike on their boots, their axes, but it also hitchhiked on the backs of birds and other animals. Pennsylvania tried to slow down the spread of this blight by burning dead trees and spraying the infected ones, but this did not slow down the spread. And Dow Baxter, the professor of plant pathology at University of Michigan, noted that certainly nothing could be more unsightly than the gaunt and naked trunks of these dead trees standing like skeletons in every vista which the eye turns. He remarked this while overlooking the Great Smoky Mountains. And it really did feel like fighting an uphill battle. So if we look at how the blight moved throughout Appalachia, by 1912, it had reached 10 different states. By 1930, it had made its way into North Carolina. By 1920, virtually all the chestnut trees in the Great Smoky Mountains were infected. By 1940, there were virtually no trees left in the Appalachians that weren't either dead or dying from the blight. And by 1950, the United States Department of Agriculture declared the American chestnut tree to be functionally extinct. William MacDonald, a professor of plant pathology at WVU, regarded that the devastation of the American chestnut by the blight represents one of the greatest recorded changes in natural plant population caused by an introduced organism. And I couldn't agree with this statement more. We'll look more on the stats of this blight, but it is shocking how many trees were affected by this. In the span of just 40 years, 200 million acres of chestnut-dominated forests were gone. And it's estimated that 4 billion trees died from this blight. That's 4 billion with a B. To put that in perspective, that's 20% of the Appalachian forest, 1/5 of the entire forest. If you look outside today and count 5 trees, back in the day, one of those would have been a chestnut. But today, those are all completely gone. And that devastation left ripples throughout the region. So what we see when the American chestnut leaves, family size actually drops by 2 individuals due to a loss of that household income. People changed the way that they started building houses. You no longer see those traditional log cabins, but you see more of what are the contemporary boxed houses. Families began incorporating more refined sugars into their diet. They were no longer baking chestnuts into their bread. They were leaning more towards refined sugars and white bread. Farmers had a much harder time letting their livestock free range. Furniture, you stop seeing handmade, homemade furniture, as well as looms and spinning wheels. These are things that were traditionally made from chestnut wood. You start to see those art forms die out. And you see a mass exodus from the mountains into urban areas. You see people leaving the countryside, leaving the mountains. And so that begs the question, well, if I go out in the woods today, can I still find a chestnut tree? And the answer is yes, but not quite the same. So today, chestnuts still grow in the wild, but you rarely find them getting more than 10 feet tall. They rarely live anywhere from, more than 4 to 6 years before they succumb to that blight. There are isolated populations of big mature chestnut trees in northern Michigan, as well as some isolated parts of upstate New York. The picture that we see here of that big chestnut tree, that's one that I found in the Adirondack Mountains. That's probably the largest chestnut I've ever seen. So chestnuts are still able to persist in the wild by doing this thing called stump sprouting. And you may have noticed this if you've ever walked past a cut down tree stump and have seen little shoots coming out of the stump. That's called stump sprouting. So a tree will sometimes put out new little growths from where the above ground portion has been cut. And chestnuts are really good at doing this. So when the blight kills the above ground portion of the tree, they'll put out new sprouts to make little new baby chestnut trees, which then live about 4 to 6 years before they die and the cycle continues. So it's not that we have no chestnuts, it's that we have no big reproductive chestnuts, which is why we regard it as functionally extinct, not truly extinct. So what's being done about this horrible, horrible blight? Well, the American Chestnut Foundation was founded in 1983, and their main prerogative was to restore the American chestnut to its former range. Their main attempt to accomplish this is by creating blight-resistant trees, by hybridizing the American chestnut with the blight-resistant Chinese chestnut. They're trying to create a tree that has all the good characteristics of an American chestnut with the blight resistance of a Chinese chestnut. Enter the Darling 58, a miracle of modern science, if you will. This was accomplished by students at the State University of New York's College of Environmental Science and Forestry, or ESF. And what these students did is they took a gene from wheat and they inserted that gene into American chestnut trees to allow the tree to produce an enzyme called oxalate oxidase. Essentially, what happens is chestnut blight kills the tree by producing oxalic acid. This destroys the vascular tissue of the tree. It prevents the tree from transporting nutrients, and it kills the tree over time. By producing this enzyme, the tree is able to break down that oxalic acid before it succumbs to the blight. So the resulting tree, is able to get infected by the blight, but it doesn't die from it. And currently, what's happening is these researchers are trying to apply for government permission to release these trees into the wild. They have not been approved. Technically, this is a genetically modified organism. And if it were to be released into the wild, it would be the first genetically modified forest tree to be released into the wild. But this tree is known as the Darling 58 tree. That is the strain of trees that they were able to create. And you may also ask yourself, why do we want to restore the American chestnut in the first place? Well, if you haven't been convinced yet by this presentation, of course, it increases the biodiversity in our forests. This is a mountain range that at one point was dominated by American chestnut, and it would be nice to see it return to that state. It helps preserve our natural heritage as well as all of those nice cultural aspects that we touched on, while at the same time providing food and shelter for wildlife, helping to remediate sites that have been deforested or degraded, especially in places like Pennsylvania where strip mining and coal mining has done so much damage. Also providing a good rot-resistant lumber for the timber industry, and providing chestnuts as a food crop not only for animals but for people as well. And so we'll kind of finish on this quote by Suzette Brewer. She said that today, somewhere deep in the American forest, grows a tiny chestnut sprout. It is a hint of a once mighty giant, a clonal survivor of a 40-million-year-old legacy emerging from the forest floor to try once again to beat back its pernicious enemy. Eventually, however, even the sprouts and their root systems will die out, and all the old Castanea dentata stock will become extinct. But these shoots and leaves have managed to survive long enough to be of service to provide a bridge towards the future. And with all my virtual tree programs, I always like to inform people whether or not you can find this tree at Raccoon Creek State Park. And for the American chestnut, I am happy to say that while we don't have any large mature chestnut trees, I have had some success finding small American chestnuts in our western section of the park in our Doak Field area. And of course, I realize there's a lot of people watching from other parts of the state. And no matter where you are, there's a state park near you. I would recommend reaching out to your local park education staff and asking about American chestnuts, if they've noticed any in the park, and where to find them, because they're a really spectacular tree to witness in person. So we'll move on to our Q&A, and my contact information will be provided. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we will do our little Q&A.
Sounds great. That was very interesting. Your interest is your personal interest in the American chestnut comes out in your speaking about it. So it's nice to hear. Let's start with a question about other trees. So are there other trees that fill the vacant role that the chestnut left behind?
There is. So once we lost the American chestnut, we saw the white oak kind of step up to the plate as a crop for wildlife. A lot of the wildlife that would eat chestnuts turned towards eating the white oak. The downfall is that white oaks only produce a large crop of seeds once every 2 years. So the chestnut would produce every single year. White oak, you only get that every 2 years. So it's not as reliable as a food source, but white oak did fill that niche.
Were there any animals that suffered as a result of the chestnut blight? You mentioned it provided food for a lot of different native species.
Yeah, there's one animal in particular that lives here in Pennsylvania called the Allegheny wood rat. The Allegheny wood rat is a threatened species, and it's believed that that's directly caused by the chestnut blight. This is a small mammal that lives in very specific habitats and back in the day would eat chestnuts. And it's believed that after chestnuts were gone, uh, it lost that good available food source. And so we think that the main reason why the Allegheny wood rat is threatened in Pennsylvania is because of the loss of chestnuts.
Are 2 trees required for pollination, and how old does a chestnut tree need to be to produce chestnuts?
That's a good question. Chestnuts can self-pollinate. You don't need two trees to cross-pollinate. They rarely get old enough to start producing nowadays. I mentioned that most trees take 4 to 6 years before they die from the blight. And it usually takes anywhere from like 8 to 10 years to reliably be producing nuts. Sometimes you get those younger trees, those 5 to 6 year old trees that produce some, but they rarely get old enough to produce those nuts.
And speaking of the nuts, how do animals break open those spiky shells?
Well, they actually break open on their own. So they're protected by that spiky husk. And once that husk dries out, it splits open. So the animals have to wait for that to happen, for that to split open, and then they can kind of peel it open and get at the nuts on the inside.
Were humans or native animals able to eat the Chinese chestnuts?
Yeah, actually, one of the reasons why Chinese chestnuts were brought over was as a food source because the nuts are slightly bigger. Uh, you can eat any species of chestnut. True chestnuts, that's not including horse chestnuts. Don't eat those. Those are poisonous. But anything in the genus Castanea uh, produces an edible nut.
Are we seeing the same thing that happened to the American chestnut tree happening to red, black, and white oak trees now? And is there anything that can be done to prevent that?
Although they're in the same family, oaks and chestnuts are all in the beech family. Oaks are not affected by the blight. It's all to do with the bark. Chestnuts have those wide, flat ridges that the blight can get in between. And our oaks don't have that vulnerability. So there are threats to oaks, but not the chestnut blight. Um, there are threats to beeches, which are in that family as well, but not the chestnut blight.
How long does it take for blight-resistant chestnut trees to be being propagated now to reach maturity and produce chestnuts?
So the growth rate is going to be about the same as a regular chestnut. They don't grow as big. So the American chestnuts, we're talking a tree that can reach 100 feet. The hybrids max out at about 60 feet, but the growth rate is about the same. So we're talking a good, reliable source of nuts after about 8 to 10 years.
Are there any other large chestnut farms other than Bloom Farm?
Not that I'm aware of, but if people are curious about sources of chestnuts, there are chapters of the American Chestnut Foundation for many different states. Pennsylvania has its own chapter, and I'm sure that the folks for the Pennsylvania chapter would know exactly where large chestnut farms are.
In a different, same kind of question, but in a different area, are there any ways to save chestnut trees that do we have a way to create a protected space for them, like the Joyce Kilmer Forest?
So I'm gonna assume that question means can we put them in a place where the blight can't get to them?
Yes.
And that's really tough because this blight seems to be everywhere. Not only did it hitchhike on the shoes and tools of people, but it was also hitchhiking on wildlife. Birds are incredibly mobile. And so where you have birds visiting one chestnut tree, they can easily pick up that blight and carry it from tree to tree to tree. And it's really hard to isolate for that reason. These are microscopic spores, and usually once you start seeing symptoms, it's pretty much over for the tree. There are some precautions that you can take, but nothing that's really going to save the tree in the long run.
So I'm going to combine two questions here. Do you have faith in the Darling 58? And is there any idea when the approvals will be, when it will get the necessary approvals?
I think the Darling 58 is an awesome piece of genetic engineering. speaking personally, I'm not here to endorse ESF. I'm not here to endorse the American Chestnut Foundation. But there's been a bit of a stir that happened lately with the Darling 58, where the American Chestnut Foundation actually rescinded its support of the Darling 58 tree. And that was because of some testing that had gone awry, where they were testing Darling 58 trees, but apparently they were uh, testing the wrong strain of Darling. It was actually a Darling 54 tree. And rather than postponing their support, they rescinded their support. There's an official statement on the American Chestnut's website that explains why they rescinded their support. But it was a very confusing situation. I hope that ESF continues to work on this transgenic tree model. I think it'd be awesome to see pure genetically American chestnut trees that are blight resistant, and I hope they continue working on it. I have
If the,
faith, but it's complicated.
well, on the same topic, if the Darling 58 trees get introduced to the wild, would they be a protected tree so they don't get taken down once they reach maturity for wood or lumber?
At first, probably. Yeah, especially considering that the American chestnut is listed as functionally extinct. I would assume it would probably gain some of the protections that endangered species get. Once they reach stable populations, they would probably be opened up to logging. But for that first initial release, they would probably be meticulously monitored. There would probably be GPS coordinates of every Darling 58 out in the woods. People would probably check on them every single year. So they would definitely be babysat for a long time.
A question about oak trees. If oak trees are blight resistant, are there efforts to make a hybrid chestnut oak tree?
That is a really fantastic question. And I think the issue there is that while oaks and chestnuts are cousins, they're a little too far removed to hybridize with each other. So chestnuts will readily hybridize with either chestnut species. There are about 9 different species of chestnut worldwide, and they can all hybridize with each other. That's everything in the genus Castanea. Oaks, on the other hand, are in the genus Quercus, so they're a little bit too far removed to readily make hybrids, although maybe there's some opportunity to work with that transgenic technology to see if maybe there's something in the oaks that can be inserted into the chestnuts. There's a lot of strides happening in that field.
What was it about the genetic material in wheat that made researchers think about introducing that into the American chestnut?
Wheat is a really heavily studied plant. It's, of course, one of the most widely grown crops in the world, and it's one of the most well-studied plants in the world. So we have its entire genome sequenced. We also know that wheat is safe for human consumption. We know that wheat produces that OXO enzyme. And so it was just the perfect candidate in that scenario. We knew that it had that gene because it had been so heavily studied and sequenced. That's not to say other plants don't hold the key to that. It's just wheat is a particularly good candidate.
Could you speak more about the economic impact on Pennsylvania and the US as a whole as a result of the chestnut blight?
Yeah, so we kind of looked at that ripple effect, what with family size dropping and uh, art forms dying out, but it also would have hit the timber industry especially hard, considering that many things were built from chestnut. In fact, we have cabins here in our park that are built from chestnut logs. So I don't have the exact numbers for how the timber industry was hit, but I assume that's probably the industry that got hit the hardest was timber. And in fact, after the blight came through, timber companies were desperate to cut down all the dead trees and log them as soon as possible before they got infested with insects. It was sort of a race to cut down all those dead standing trees.
Was there a genetic limitation in the original native population that caused such a widespread susceptibility to the blight?
It's more so that the Japanese and Chinese chestnuts had something the American didn't. The problem with these types of diseases is that this fungus co-evolved with the Japanese and the Chinese chestnuts to the point where they weren't affected. This is a disease that could uh, use Japanese and Chinese chestnuts as a host tree, but those trees are really good at fighting it off. They have a long, several million year repertoire with each other. When you bring that non-native tree over to North America and expose that fungus to a tree that has not co-evolved with it, it cannot shake off that disease. So it's not that Japanese and Chinese chestnuts don't get blight, it's that their immune systems are good at fighting it off, whereas the American chestnut has no immunal ability to fight off that disease. So it's a question of how things co-evolve with each other.
Are there any programs in Pennsylvania where you can obtain free chestnut trees? Sometimes forestry programs offer seedlings.
There used to be a program with the Pennsylvania chapter of the American Chestnut Foundation. They put that program on hold recently just because of the high demand. They didn't have the chestnut seedlings to keep up with it. And I reached out to them earlier this year. It's still on hold. Hopefully, they'll open that program back up soon, but they're the ones who have that program. The Game Commission also sometimes does programs like that. They don't always have chestnut seedlings, but they have programs similar where you can ask for seedlings for educational programs.
One of the listeners has a comment about the chestnut orchard at the Tyler Arboretum, saying that there's some there that are quite tall. They're beautiful, but most of them are blighted. Have you been to visit the Arboretum?
Not that one specifically. Personally, we had an orchard at the college that I went to. I went to Juniata College, and we have a research orchard with the American Chestnut Foundation. And so I've walked through that grove many times, lamenting the loss of these trees, but also admiring the good, strong-looking hybrids in there. But I'll have to check that out.
Another question about, is there a hybrid being planted in a program, an Asian chestnut that the blight fungus doesn't impact, and then they hybridized it with an American one? Have you heard of this? Can you speak a little more about that?
Yeah, so that's called back crossing. What the American Chestnut Foundation is trying to accomplish is they're trying to create a hybrid tree that has the blight resistance, but is mostly American chestnut genetic wise. We're talking something that's 99% American chestnut and 1% Chinese chestnut, but just enough to make it blight resistant. And so if we think about genetics, we have let's say you have an American chestnut and a Chinese chestnut. You hybridize them, their offspring end up being 50-50. But we don't want 50-50. We want 99 and 1. And so what you do is you back cross. You take that 50% hybrid and cross it with 100% American. Now your ratio is at 75-25, and you keep going back and back crossing until you end up with that 99-1%. So that's how the process works. So you do have to cross hybrids with pure Americans in order to end up with that ideal tree.
So are there programs like citizen science programs or other ways that the general public can help or get involved?
Yes, there is a form on the American Chestnut Foundation's website where if you think you have an American chestnut, you can record its location and they'll actually send someone out to confirm. Or you can take a leaf sample, press it between two pieces of cardboard to get the leaf nice and flat. You can mail it to them and they can confirm whether or not it's pure American. And so that's one thing you can do. I always recommend iNaturalist to people interested in community science. It's a great online tool. Whenever I find an American chestnut, I upload its location and people will come in and debate whether or not they think it's a hybrid or a pure American. So I'd recommend iNaturalist for uploading your findings. And if you really want to let people know that you found an American chestnut, you can go to the American Chestnut Foundation directly.
Thank you to everyone for attending today and for your wonderful questions. Joe, what would you like the audience to remember from today's program?
Just that this tree is a very tragic tale, and this tree is a part of our heritage. We should admire it, we should remember it, and we should anticipate its return.
Thank you, Joe, so much for presenting today's program.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for watching.
So please join us again for more Learn at Lunchtime programs. Visit the State Museum of Pennsylvania's website at statemuseumpa.org for program information and to sign up.